Federal prosecutors thought they had a case that could not fail. They believed the evidence was strong, the story was clear, and the punishment would be huge. The crime they were dealing with was not a small theft. It was a jewelry heist that people were calling one of the biggest in U.S. history. The value was said to be around $100 million. That number alone made everyone pay attention. The plan seemed simple for the government. They had arrests, they had charges, they had a path to trial. And they believed that when the case reached a courtroom, the jury would quickly see what happened. A long prison sentence looked almost certain. Behind the scenes, teams of investigators and lawyers worked for months. They collected records, tracked movements, and looked at every detail. They tried to show not only that the theft happened, but also that each person charged played a part. In a big case like this, the government does not just want one guilty person. They want the full group, the whole network, the chain from planning to payoff. The theft itself sounded like something from a movie, but the people working the case knew it was real. They were not chasing rumors. They were building a case piece by piece. They believed they knew who did what, when they did it, and how they got away with it, at least for a while. 7 people ended up being charged. That meant prosecutors believed there was not just one mastermind, but a team. In cases like this, some people watch, some people plan, some people drive, some people break in, and some people help hide or sell what was stolen. Prosecutors believed this group worked together like that. One of the defendants stood out. Prosecutors said he played an important role even before the theft happened. He was not just someone who appeared at the last second. According to the government's story, he helped make the crime possible. They believed he followed an armored truck. An armored truck is not a normal delivery van. It is built to carry valuable things, like cash or jewels, and it is protected by strong metal and security steps. Following one is not easy if you do not know what you are doing, but investigators believed this man watched it carefully. In the government's view, he watched where it went, he watched how it moved, he watched when it stopped and when it started. That kind of watching is called surveillance, and it can turn a hard target into an easier one. If you know when security is relaxed or when a truck is parked, you can pick the best time to strike. Prosecutors believed that was his job, to help turn an opportunity into action. But in court, the case was not finished. He did not admit guilt. He pleaded not guilty. That meant he told the court, "I did not do this," and he was demanding a full trial. The legal process was moving forward. Dates were being set. Motions were being filed. Lawyers were arguing about what evidence could be used and what could not. He was also out on bail. Bail is when the court allows a defendant to stay out of jail while waiting for trial, usually by paying money or agreeing to follow strict rules. Those rules can include checking in with a court officer, staying in one place, and not leaving the area. Bail is not freedom like normal life. It is freedom with a leash. Still, prosecutors likely felt fine about it. They believed he would show up. They believed the court system was in control. Then, quietly, something changed. The criminal case was still active. Nothing had been dismissed. No trial had happened. He was still a defendant facing serious charges. But suddenly, he was no longer only part of the criminal court system. He was taken into immigration custody. Immigration custody is different from criminal custody. It is not about being guilty or not guilty of a crime in a U.S. court. It is about whether someone is allowed to stay in the country. It is handled through immigration courts and immigration officers, not the same judges and prosecutors who handle federal criminal trials. Now there were 2 systems moving at the same time, the criminal system and the immigration system. And here is the part that made the story so strange. These 2 systems were not moving together. They were moving separately, like 2 trains on different tracks, and the people on one train did not seem to know what was happening on the other. This is where the tension begins to grow. In a normal situation, you would expect federal criminal prosecutors and immigration officials to share important information. You would expect someone to say, "Wait, this person is on trial. We need to coordinate." You would expect alarms to ring. But in this case, that coordination did not happen, or it did not happen in time. As the weeks passed, the case in criminal court still looked like it was heading toward trial. Prosecutors continued preparing. Defense lawyers continued fighting. The court schedule continued moving. On paper, the case was still alive and pushing forward. Meanwhile, inside the immigration system, something else was happening. There was an immigration hearing. It was not a big public event. It was not the kind of thing that makes headlines right away.
It was brief, and it stayed mostly out of sight. At that hearing, a request was made. The defendant wanted to leave the country voluntarily. Voluntary departure is exactly what it sounds like.
Instead of fighting immigration court and being formally removed, a person can sometimes ask for permission to leave on their own. It can come with rules, deadlines, and legal effects. But the key point is this: the person leaves. And the most shocking part, according to the story, is that there was no public announcement. There was no loud warning. There was no big alert sent out saying, "This defendant in a major federal case is about to exit the United States." Days later, he was gone. Gone not from the courtroom, but from the country. For prosecutors, this was like preparing for a championship game and then finding out one of the main players had vanished overnight. They were still building their trial plan. They were still expecting court dates. The courtroom was still waiting. But one of the defendants was no longer in the United States. The moment prosecutors learned what happened did not come with flashing lights. It came through legal paperwork. A court filing made the reality clear. The words on the page forced everyone to face the truth. The defendant had left. At that point, the story shifted. It was no longer only about guilt or innocence. It became about something else. What happens when a person charged in a major federal crime is no longer inside the country, and the system allowed it to happen without warning? The discovery hit prosecutors like a cold wave. They had been preparing as if the case was moving normally. They expected to fight hard in court, prove the story, and win. Instead, they were suddenly forced to deal with a problem that should not have existed at all.
A criminal trial cannot happen if the defendant is not there. In most cases, the person must be present. They must hear the evidence, face the witnesses, and be able to speak with their lawyer. If the person is gone, the case gets stuck. It does not matter how strong the evidence is if the court cannot even move forward. When the defendant left the country, it created a new kind of battle. The defense moved fast. They did not argue about the jewelry or the truck right away. They argued about the case itself. They asked the judge for something extreme. They wanted the charges permanently dismissed. That is like asking the court to erase the case completely, as if it never happened. If a case is dismissed with prejudice, it usually means prosecutors cannot bring it back, ever. It is over for good. Why would the defense ask for that? Because they could argue the government lost its chance. They could argue the system failed, and the defendant should not be punished for a failure the government allowed. But prosecutors pushed back hard. They did not want the case erased. They wanted it left open. Their argument was simple. Even if the defendant was gone now, he might return someday. If he returned, they wanted to be ready. They wanted the case to still exist so they could pick it back up and bring him to trial. So the fight became a legal tug-of-war, not over what happened in the heist, but over whether the court should keep the charges alive or kill them forever. This is where legal experts started to pay attention. People who study the justice system and watch court cases for a living said this situation was unusual. In most federal cases, especially big ones, immigration issues and criminal cases do not just drift apart. Normally, if someone is facing serious criminal charges, authorities make sure that person stays available for court. If immigration officers have the person, they often coordinate with prosecutors. They usually do not allow a person to simply leave if that departure would break the criminal case. But here, that coordination did not happen, or it broke down. And it happened quietly. No big press conference, no dramatic moment in court where everyone gasped. Just paperwork, decisions, and then silence. Then the silence turned into shock. The judge had to consider tough questions. Was it fair to keep charges open against someone who was no longer in the country? Could prosecutors reasonably bring him back? Did the system's mistake or lack of coordination hurt the defendant's rights? The defense would likely say, "You cannot hold this over him forever. If the government let him go, that is on them. You cannot keep a case hanging like a shadow." Prosecutors would likely say, "He is charged with a very serious crime.
The public deserves a chance for justice. If he returns, the case should be ready." At the center of all of it was the strange fact that two government systems had acted like strangers to each other. Immigration moved ahead with a process that ended in departure. Criminal prosecutors were still preparing for trial, unaware that the ground beneath their feet was shifting. To many people, it feels impossible. The government is the government, right? Shouldn't it all work together? But in real life, different agencies have different goals, different paperwork, different officers, and sometimes different priorities. And when communication fails, problems can grow. This failure had a cost. The victims were still waiting. Jewelry theft is not only about shiny objects. Jewelry often has deep meaning. It can be family history, special gifts, pieces connected to weddings, birthdays, or loved ones who passed away. Even if insurance covers money, it does not always replace what was lost. And in this case, the loss was huge. The value was so large that it became a headline number. But for victims, it is not only the number. It is the feeling of being violated, of being targeted, and of being left with no clear ending. They expected a trial. They expected answers. They expected to hear what happened, who did it, and whether the stolen jewelry could be recovered. Now they had none of that. No verdict, no full public story in court, no final moment where a judge says, "This is what happened, and this is the punishment." Instead, they had an unfinished case and a missing defendant. Legal experts said cases like this rarely end this way. It is not common for a defendant in a major federal prosecution to leave the country while the case is still active. It is even less common for prosecutors to be surprised by it. That word, surprised, matters here. Prosecutors are usually the people who know everything in advance. They are the ones who plan, track, and prepare. They are not supposed to be caught off guard by basic facts like whether a defendant is still inside the country. Yet the court filing made it clear. They were stunned. And now the case was caught in a strange half-life. It was not dead, but it was not fully alive. It was like a book with the last chapter ripped out. The heist was historic. The prosecution was prepared. And the defendant left. The ending was not a courtroom ending. It was an airport ending, a border ending, a paperwork ending. And that created a haunting final question. Will this story ever reach a courtroom ending? Or has it already slipped beyond reach? Because even if prosecutors keep the case open, time changes everything. Witness memories fade. Evidence becomes harder to manage. People move away.
And as years pass, it becomes harder to bring a clean, strong case to a jury. On the other hand, some cases wait a long time and still return. Some defendants do come back. Some are arrested when they travel. Some are found through international cooperation. But none of that is guaranteed. What is guaranteed is this. Right now, the case is incomplete. The justice system was ready to tell the story of a massive theft in a courtroom, with evidence and witnesses and a clear result. But instead, the story paused in the middle. And for the victims, that pause can feel like the worst part. Because when you lose something precious, you want the ending to matter. You want to know the truth. You want to see responsibility. You want to feel that the system worked. Here, the system did not give them that. It gave them a question mark. The unusual outcome did not just bother the victims. It also raised questions for people who care about how justice works. When two legal systems fail to connect, the results can feel unfair to everyone. Think about what happened. A person is charged in a major criminal case. The court is moving toward trial. Prosecutors are working. Defense lawyers are working. The case is active.
Then immigration takes custody of the same person. Immigration court moves quickly. The person asks to leave voluntarily. The request is granted. The person leaves the country. And criminal prosecutors do not know until after he is gone. That is the core of the shock. If the systems had worked together, someone might have said, "Stop. This person is needed for trial." Or someone might have told the criminal court, "Immigration is about to move him." There could have been a plan, like keeping him in custody until the trial was done, or setting rules that stopped him from leaving. But instead, the handoff did not happen in a way that protected the criminal case. Now, prosecutors had to decide what to do next. They could not just pretend it did not happen. They had to explain it to the judge. They had to respond to defense motions. They had to answer hard questions about why a defendant in such a serious case was allowed to leave. The defense, meanwhile, had a strong position to argue from. They could say the government cannot hold a person's life in limbo forever. They could say it was unfair to keep charges hanging when the defendant is gone and cannot face the case. They could argue that the government made the mistake, so the government should suffer the result. Prosecutors, however, could argue something else. They could say the defendant is the one who wanted to leave.
They could say he benefited from leaving. They could say justice should not disappear just because borders exist. They could argue the public interest is too important. This kind of argument turns the case into something more than a crime story. It becomes a story about rules, power, and responsibility. It also becomes a story about jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is a legal word that basically means who has the authority and where. A U.S. criminal court has authority over crimes charged in that court, but it cannot easily force a person in another country to show up. Immigration authorities have authority over whether someone can remain in the U.S., but they do not run criminal trials. When these authorities pull in different directions, you get a mess. In this case, that mess had real consequences. One consequence was the sense of lost control. A federal criminal case is supposed to be steady and careful. When something like this happens, it makes people wonder, if this can happen in a huge case, what can happen in smaller ones? Another consequence was emotional. For victims, a justice system that cannot finish a case can feel like a second injury. First, they lose their property. Then they lose the chance to see the case resolved. And for the public, it creates a strange feeling too. People are used to hearing stories where a big crime leads to a big trial. They expect an ending.
Even if they do not know the victims, they want to believe the system works. But sometimes, the system does not provide the ending people expect. There is also the question of what happens next. If the charges stay open, the defendant could be arrested if he returns to the United States. He could also be arrested if he travels somewhere that cooperates with U.S. law enforcement. But that depends on many factors: where he goes, whether his name appears in the right databases, how strong the legal steps are, and whether officials in another country will help. If the charges are dismissed permanently, then even if he returns, the criminal case might be gone. That is why prosecutors fought to keep it open. For them, dismissing the case forever would feel like losing the whole point of the work they did. The judge's decision on this kind of question is a serious one. It affects not just this case, but how similar situations might be handled in the future. It also sends a message about what happens when government parts do not coordinate. Legal experts said the most surprising part was not just that the defendant left, it was that the departure seemed to happen without criminal prosecutors being warned in time. That is what made people describe them as stunned. And the phrase "quietly leaves" is important too. It suggests there was no dramatic chase, no last-minute arrest at the airport, no public scramble. It was quiet. Quiet can be scarier than loud. Loud means people see the problem. Quiet means the problem can grow unnoticed until it is too late. Now, step back and look at the bigger picture of this story. At the start, prosecutors believed they had a case built for conviction. They had charges against 7 people. They believed they understood the roles. They believed they could prove the plan. They believed a long sentence was likely. The case was moving toward trial. Then the story shifted to the man at the center, a defendant accused of helping the crime even before it happened. Prosecutors believed he followed the armored truck and watched its movements. They believed he helped create the opportunity. He pleaded not guilty, and the court process moved forward. Then came the quiet turn: immigration custody, 2 systems moving separately. Then came the decision nobody expected: voluntary departure granted, no public announcement, prosecutors not alerted. Then came the moment of realization. Prosecutors learned after the fact. The courtroom was waiting, but the defendant was gone. Then came the legal fallout. Defense asks for permanent dismissal. Prosecutors fight to keep the case alive. Then came the unusual outcome. Experts stunned because coordination usually prevents this. And then came the last act, those left without closure. That is where the story ends for now. Not with a verdict, but with uncertainty. A historic theft, a prepared prosecution, and a defendant who left the country. The case is not closed, but it is not complete. The final question still hangs in the air. Will the story ever return to a courtroom ending, or has it already slipped beyond reach? And that is what makes this story so unsettling. It is not only about stolen jewelry. It is about a system that was supposed to deliver a clear result, and instead delivered an unfinished ending.